I got this FT990 this week. It had a frozen main tuning dial. I mean, as in would not budge main tuning dial. It otherwise seemed to be working just fine. So they're hard to find replacements for, at least exact replacements. But here's one that I got on Digikey. You can see the model number there. Cost me $50 on Digikey. You can see how it's different from the unit that came out of it. However, I think I can adapt it in and make it work. Most importantly, it has the same electrical characteristics. The problem appears to be only in the mechanics. And I don't have a good way to hold this, but let me see if I can show you. You'll notice this is a much larger diameter than this. However, you'll notice that this has a little collar right here. And I think this collar, I measured it, it's the same diameter as this, so I think this will fit into the front panel. The other thing is you'll notice that this shaft is shorter than the original shaft. However, you can see right here where the set screw is, and I think the set screw will pick up enough of this shaft to make the whole thing work. Anyway, we're going to find out. The encoder plugs into jack J9136, and you can see it's that empty jack in this image. And pin 1 is on the right, and that's the one with the black dot. And then it goes pin 1, 2, 3, and pin 4 is the plus bias, and you can see that's marked with a red. Now my encoder didn't come with quite the same color scheme, color coding, as this is what was plugged into it. So you can see what I did. I had to figure out which was which and connect them accordingly. I'll give you the pinout for that a little bit later. I am pleased to report that the encoder went back in and it worked flawlessly. I've got this rig, nicest rig I've ever owned, back in the air, working great. Here is the pinout that I promised you for that rotary encoder harness. Let's see here. I think you should be able to see that. There you go. And here, by the way, is the old encoder, and you can see where I cut off the harness, and you can see how much of it I took. I left almost nothing there so that I could have a nice long harness and splice it together, as you saw earlier in that earlier video. Anyway, it's working great. Now I'll give you a few words of encouragement for how to do this. I'm going to assume that you have already downloaded the service manual for this rig. It's readily available online from numerous sources, and you know it's valuable because it shows you, as an example, that there are 10 screws to get the cover off, and there's 10 screws to get the bottom off, and it tells you that over here on the side, on both sides, there's 2 flathead screws, one about here that gets removed on each side, and then one down here that's actually sort of a pivot that gets loosened, and then the front panel folds forward to that situation or state that you saw in the earlier portion of my video. Then you have to take out about, I don't know, a dozen screws out of the circuit board so you can move that PCB around. Now I did not feel like pulling all those connectors, labeling all those connectors, pulling that PCB out all the way. So I chose to just remove all the screws and just wiggle and jiggle and snake that PC board up just enough so that I could then pull out the encoder and then snake in the new encoder and put everything back together. And you know, there's a lot of opportunity in there to screw things up because there's a lot of wires and harnesses, and there are PCB mounted switches and stuff. But anyway, that was my choice. And the one thing I'll say is when you put that new encoder in, you want the harness portion of the encoder facing towards the bottom of the rig, because when you close that panel back up, there's an oblong slot cut in the PC board to provide clearance for the encoder. And of course this encoder is bigger than the original encoder, and you have to make sure that it's oriented properly in order to have it fit into that PC board. And by the way, I'm showing you this close up here in case it didn't come out clearly in the other video. So anyway, what I did was I snaked the new one in there, I put the nut, I made sure that that little ridge was centered up and locating the encoder in the hole, the panel hole. And then I put the nut on from the front panel, just barely finger tight. And then, I wiggled and jiggled and kind of got that PC board back into position. And here's a really important thing to remember. That PC board really has to truly be in position, and it has to be sitting riding on top of each of the threaded studs that it mounts to. You don't want it it needs to settle on each of those studs nice and flush, because if it's not resting naturally on that stud, when you put in some of those screws, if that screw bends the board down or flexes it in any way, you're liable to cause a problem right then and there, or there will be some future performance problem due to, thermal stresses and that sort of thing. So you really have to make sure that the board is resting in there properly. And then I put in each of the, I don't know, dozen screws or so, just not even tight. I waited until they were all in there, and I made sure that everything was resting properly, and then I tightened up all the screws and folded up the wires and carefully folded up the front panel and put it all back together, and wow, it worked. Here it is. And yes, indeed, the when I put the front knob back on, that shaft from the encoder, though it was shorter than the original, it protruded out enough so that I could engage it with a set screw. And I recommend that you position the shaft so that the set screw comes back down on the round portion. Don't be lured into trying to make it set up on the flat portion, because the set screw is not long enough to do that. Anyway, I think that's all I've got to say. And I wish you luck. Hope this helps.